Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Hearthkyn Warriors for the Leagues of Votann, which are part of Warhammer 40,000. As you can see, the first thing I've done is sprayed them with some matte black spray from Colourforge. The very first thing we're going to do is we're going to be using some Corvus Black, and we're going to dry brush that onto any areas that will eventually remain a black colour. This will be followed by a second dry brush. This time it will be of an Eshin Grey. The dry brush is going to be a little bit softer this time, as we're really trying to pick out the more sharper details, and we don't want to start taking away from the black colour. Then one final dry brush, and this time it is the lightest dry brush, and this time we're going to be using Mechanicus Standard Grey. This time we're definitely just trying to pick out all the edges and the sharper points. Next, I'm going to use some Cadian Flesh Tone to paint any areas where I can see some skin. For me, I've got about a 50-50 ratio of helmets and sort of visible skin, so it's not going to take too long. Next up, I'm then going to use some Avalanche Sunset to start painting all of the suits that are underneath the armor. This might take a couple of coats as you are working on a darker color. Then both the skin and the undersuit will receive a wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. Once our wash is dried, I'm then going to start working on the eyes, and for that I'm going to use some Abaddon Black while completely missing the camera shot. Then, while still missing the camera shot, I'm going to use some matte white. And then finally, a little bit of Abaddon Black to dot for the pupils. Then I'm going to relayer the skin with some Cadian Flesh Tone, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. For the next highlight, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. And then finally, Kislev Flesh just by itself, but this is aimed squarely at the sort of more finer points and finer areas of detail. Things like cheekbones and noses. With the skin out of the way, I'm going to move back to the suit, and I'm going to relayer the Avalanche Sunset. Once again, I'm going to make sure I avoid any of the recesses. I'm then going to use a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Ural Yellow for the next highlight. Then for the final highlight, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Ural Yellow and Matte White. I am skipping the Ural Yellow completely, as it's a little bit too bright for my tastes for the suits. Then any pouches, the sort of knee pads and elbow pads, and the gloves are going to be painted with some Catachan Flesh. Next, I want to start working on any silver metal, and for that I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel. Then for all of the brown and most of the metal, excluding the weaponry, I'm going to use some Nuln Oil. Then for the weaponry, I'm going to use a little bit of Agrax Earthshade. Once our wash is dried, I'm then going to use a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand Steel and Stormhost Silver to start highlighting all of the metal areas. This will then be followed by Stormhost Silver just by itself for more finer areas and finer sort of details. Then finally, I'm going to use the Stormhost Silver to paint any rivets or sort of things like rivets that are dotted around the armor. Take your time with this and use your smallest and thinnest brush, because it'll be a lot easier. Then moving on to the pouches and all the brown areas, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Catachan Flesh and Knight's Quest of Flesh for the first highlight. And then I'm going to use Night Quest of Flesh just by itself for the second. This is a little bit thinned down, so it's a lot more subtler and it's a lot more sort of smoother for the transition from light to dark. For the grips on the handles of the weapons and on the hilts of any blades, I'm going to use some Screamer Pink. And I'm just going to simply give those a little bit of a wash with some Nuln Oil. For some of the exposed hair, I'm going to have like a blonde colour. So for that, I'm going to start with a bit of Xandri dust. And I'm simply just going to wash that with some Agrax Earthshade. Anybody that's going to be grey hair, going to be painted with some Admin Grey. Don't forget to do bushy eyebrows as well. And then for a tiny bit of depth, I'm going to use a little bit of Nuln Oil for this shade. Any gold areas are then going to be painted with some Retributor armour. And that'll be washed with some Agrax Earthshade. Next, for any red lights, I'm going to start with a base coat of Mephiston Red. I'm also going to paint the blade as well. Then the lights on the edge of the blade will receive a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Wild Rider Red. This will then be followed by Wild Rider Red just by itself. And then for the final highlight on the lights, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Wild Rider Red and Matte White. Continuing with the blade, however, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix with Wild Rider Red and Avalanche Sunset, just sticking closer to the edge with each highlight. This will be followed by Avalanche Sunset just by itself. And then a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Uriel Yellow. Any blue lights on these guys will be painted with some Macragge Blue for the base coat. Followed by a 50-50 mix of Macragge Blue and Calgar Blue for the first highlight. And then Calgar Blue for the second. I'm then going to use a little bit of Lothern Blue to paint the power source in the pistol. And I'm going to highlight that with a 50-50 mix of Lothern Blue and Matte White. With the lights out of the way, I'm going to go back to the gold. I'm going to highlight that with some Retributor armor to begin with, relayering everything, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Retributor armor and Stormhost silver. Finally, on one of the backpacks, there's a little bit of folded cloth. So for that, I'm going to start with a base coat of Rakarth Flesh. And then I'll give it a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. And then I forgot to record this section, but I just highlighted it with some more Rakarth Flesh. You can base yours however you like, but for me, I'm going to use some Astro Granite, as these are from the Combat Patrol magazine. So I've got the Astro Granite handy, and it's going to tie everything else with the rest of the Combat Patrol magazine. Once that is dried, I'm then going to give it a quick dry brush with some Admin Grey. Then I'm going to neaten up the bases with some Abaddon Black. And finally, I'm going to use a little bit of brown weathering powder to put some dust on their feet, so it makes it look a little bit sort of battle worn, but not too much. There we are, that's these guys out of the way. I had such a blast painting them. Luckily for me, I've got 2 more full units to paint, because I'm going to repaint the other colour scheme that I've got into this colour scheme, so I think it's a lot cooler than the red and blue that I've got. Overall, these guys took approximately 8 hours to paint, give or take sort of wash times to dry and things like that. Thank you so much for watching. If you follow this guide, I really do hope it helped. And if it did help, give the channel a subscribe, the video a like, and a share if possible. We've got plenty of other paint guides on the channel. It's not just for Warhammer 40,000 as well. We've got other games like Star Wars Shadow, Other Crisis Protocol, Marvel Zombies, and other things like that. Whatever I feel like, to be honest. Just have a look around and check it out. Thanks again, and all I have to say is goodbye for now. So goodbye for now.